On the morning of September 26, 1855, a 16-year-old boy walked into a shipping office on the Cleveland docks and asked for a job. He was hired as an assistant bookkeeper for 50 cents a day, and he would say for the rest of his life that no single day that came after it, not even the day, 15 years later, when he founded the company that would make him the richest man the world had ever seen, meant quite as much to him as that one. His name was John Davison Rockefeller, and the company was Standard Oil. By the time he died in 1937, he had built a business empire so dominant that the United States government eventually broke it apart by order of the Supreme Court, been denounced from pulpits and burned in effigy as the face of everything Americans feared about unchecked wealth, and quietly given away more money than almost anyone in history before him. He did all of it, by nearly every account, without ever once raising his voice. This is the story of how a careful, joyless young bookkeeper from rural New York built the largest business empire in American history, and how that empire eventually reshaped, and very nearly broke, the country around it. John Davison Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1839, in a farmhouse in Richford, New York, a small hamlet in the rolling hill country south of the Finger Lakes. His mother, Eliza Davison, was a devout, strict Baptist woman, thrifty almost to the point of severity, who raised her children on Bible verses and household discipline. His father was another matter entirely. William Avery Rockefeller, known to almost everyone as Big Bill, was a large, loud, magnetic man who made his living any way he could get away with: timber trading, horse dealing, and eventually selling bottled elixirs door to door under the name Dr. William A. Rockefeller, celebrated cancer specialist, promising cures he could not possibly deliver. He was, by most honest accounts, a con man and a bigamist, besides, maintaining a second family under a false name for years, while his first family had no idea. He would disappear from home for months at a stretch and reappear with cash, stories, and no explanations that anyone was allowed to question. It would be easy to assume this chaotic upbringing scarred young John into rebellion, but it seems to have done the opposite. Watching his father's reckless, charming unreliability up close taught him to crave the exact opposite in his own life: order, sobriety, predictability, and control. He began keeping his own financial ledger as a boy, a small notebook he called Ledger A, in which he recorded every cent of income and every cent given to church or charity. That habit of recording, measuring, and never losing track of a single dollar would define the rest of his life. Big Bill, oddly enough, also taught him hard lessons in negotiation. He would lend John small sums at high interest rates and insist they be repaid exactly, treating his own son the way he treated any business mark, which taught the boy early that sentiment had no place in a ledger. There are stories, passed down through family letters and later biographies, of Big Bill testing his sons in small, almost cruel ways, supposedly once instructing a hired man to knock young John off a fence post so that when the boy naturally reached out to catch him, he would learn never to trust anyone completely, even his own father. Whether that particular anecdote is entirely true or embellished by later retelling, it captures something real about the household John grew up in. Warmth and instability braided together so tightly that the two became almost indistinguishable. His mother, Eliza, left to manage the household and the children largely alone for long stretches, while her husband traveled on his mysterious business, ran a home defined by frugality, scripture, and quiet endurance. She made her own soap and candles, mended clothing until it could not be mended further, and impressed upon her children, John most of all, that idleness and waste were close to sinful. It was a household that produced, almost predictably, a boy who trusted numbers far more than he trusted people, and who found in careful accounting a kind of emotional safety that the adults around him could never quite provide. The family moved several times during John's boyhood, eventually settling near Cleveland, Ohio, a fast-growing lake port and rail junction in the 1850s. Rockefeller attended Cleveland Central High School and then completed a short course at a local business college, learning bookkeeping, the one skill that would open his first real door. On September 26, 1855, a date he later celebrated privately every year for the rest of his life as Job Day, a 16-year-old Rockefeller walked into the office of Hewitt and Tuttle, a produce shipping and commission merchant firm on the Cleveland docks, and asked for work. He was hired as an assistant bookkeeper for 50 cents a day. He later said that no single day of his life, not even the day he founded Standard Oil, meant more to him than that first day of employment, because it was the day he proved he could support himself through discipline and precision rather than his father's charm and risk. Rockefeller thrived at Hewitt and Tuttle, absorbing the mechanics of shipping, freight rates, and commodity margins with an intensity his employers found almost unsettling in someone so young. By 1859, at just 19 years old, he was ready to strike out on his own. He partnered with a slightly older, more experienced merchant named Morris Clark, and together they formed Clark and Rockefeller, a commission house dealing in grain, hay, meats, and other produce along the Cleveland docks. Rockefeller put in $1,000 of capital, borrowed from his father at 10% interest. Big Bill, charging his own son market rate, one final lesson in hard-nosed business from an otherwise unreliable man. The firm did well almost immediately, clearing several $1,000s in profit in its first year, a genuine achievement for two young men with no family fortune behind them. That same year, 1859, something happened 300 miles east of Cleveland that would eventually change the course of Rockefeller's entire life, though he barely noticed it at the time. In the sleepy town of Titusville, Pennsylvania, a retired railroad conductor named Edwin Drake, working for a group of investors, successfully drilled the first commercial oil well in American history, striking crude oil at a depth of about 70 feet on August 27th. Within weeks, the quiet farmland of northwestern Pennsylvania transformed into a chaotic, muddy, fortune-hunting frontier. Boomtowns with names like Pithole and Oil City sprang up almost overnight, populated by speculators, drillers, con artists, and desperate men chasing the promise of instant wealth. Wooden derricks crowded the hillsides so densely that the region looked, in photographs from the era, like a forest that had been replaced entirely by drilling rigs. Oil gushed, prices swung wildly from a few cents a barrel to over $10 and back again within months, and men who had been paupers on a Tuesday were sometimes millionaires by Friday, and paupers again a month later. Pithole itself became a strange, brief legend of American excess. Before the oil rush, it was essentially uninhabited farmland. Within a year of a major strike there in 1865, it had a population estimated at somewhere between 10 and 15,000 people, along with hotels, a theater, dozens of saloons, its own daily newspaper, and reportedly the third busiest post office in the entire state of Pennsylvania, all built almost entirely out of unseasoned green lumber thrown up in a matter of weeks. Within just a few years, as nearby wells ran dry and speculators moved on to the next promising strike, Pithole emptied out almost as fast as it had filled, its buildings dismantled for scrap lumber or simply left to rot until barely anything remained but overgrown foundations. It is, today, an official Pennsylvania historic site, preserved specifically because there is so little left to see. A ghost town that tells the story of the entire early oil industry in miniature. Explosive growth, reckless speculation, and sudden collapse, all compressed into a handful of years. It was exactly this kind of boom and bust instability that convinced Rockefeller drilling itself was closer to gambling than business. He reportedly toured the oil regions in person during these early boom years and came away unimpressed and slightly repelled by what he saw. Men risking their entire savings on a single well that might strike a fortune or might strike nothing at all, with no reliable way to predict which. Refining, by contrast, offered something drilling never could: a business where volume, efficiency, and careful cost control mattered far more than luck, and where a disciplined operator willing to reinvest patiently could, in theory, win regardless of which particular oil field happened to be producing in a given year. That single insight, choosing the boring, controllable link in the supply chain over the exciting, unpredictable one, may be the single most important business decision Rockefeller ever made, the seed from which everything that followed eventually grew. Rockefeller watched this frenzy from a careful distance, and what he saw was not opportunity in drilling. He saw chaos, and chaos to a man who worshipped order was terrifying rather than exciting. He noticed something the wildcatters mostly ignored. No matter how wildly the price of crude oil swung, someone still had to refine that crude into kerosene, the fuel that was rapidly replacing whale oil for household lighting across America and much of the world. Refining looked to him like the stable, controllable link in an otherwise unpredictable chain, and stability was exactly what Rockefeller wanted. In 1863, he and his partners invested in a small refinery on the Cleveland Flats called the Excelsior Works, going into business with a skilled English-born chemist named Samuel Andrews, who understood the technical side of distillation better than anyone else in the group. The refinery partnership was formalized as Andrews, Clark and Company. The produce business and the refining business began to pull Rockefeller in different directions, and the friction between him and his original partner, Maurice Clark, grew steadily worse. Clark wanted to keep operations modest and cautious. Rockefeller, despite his personal caution in matters of money and morality, wanted to expand the refinery aggressively, reinvesting nearly every dollar of profit back into bigger stills and greater capacity rather than pulling out dividends. The disagreement came to a head in early 1865 when the partners agreed to dissolve the firm and auction off the business to whichever partner bid highest. In a tense, sealed bid auction held in a Cleveland law office, Rockefeller outbid Clark, paying $72,500 for full control of the refinery, a staggering sum for a 25-year-old to raise, requiring him to borrow heavily against future profits. He later called that auction the most important single transaction of his business life, the moment he stopped being anyone's junior partner and became sole master of his own operation. Freed from Clark's caution, Rockefeller expanded with a relentlessness that startled even his allies. He renamed the firm Rockefeller and Andrews and began plowing every available dollar into larger stills, better equipment, and critically, into controlling as many steps of the refining process as he possibly could. In 1866, he brought in a new partner who would prove indispensable: Henry Flagler, a sharp, ambitious former grain merchant with a gift for negotiation that even outpaced Rockefeller's own. Rockefeller and Flagler had known each other socially for years before going into business together, both having married into Cleveland's tight-knit circle of ambitious young merchant families, and the two men quickly developed a working relationship built on long, unhurried strategy conversations, often conducted on walks together rather than in formal meetings, that both later described as the true engine room of the company's early growth. Flagler's brother-in-law, a wealthy whiskey distiller named Stephen Harkness, provided fresh capital in exchange for a silent partnership, and by 1867 the operation had been reorganized once more as Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler. It was Flagler, more than anyone besides Rockefeller himself, who pioneered the tactic that would define, and later condemn, the entire enterprise, securing secret preferential shipping rates from the railroads that Standard's competitors could never match. Flagler proved to be an extraordinarily gifted negotiator with railroad executives, understanding instinctively that a railroad's greatest fear was an empty freight car making a return trip with nothing to carry, and he used Standard's growing shipping volume to extract terms that smaller, irregular shippers had no comparable leverage to demand. Flagler himself would later leave the oil business behind entirely in the 1880s to pursue an entirely separate fortune developing hotels, resorts, and railroads along the Florida coast, effectively founding the modern tourism industry of Florida and helping build the rail line that eventually connected Miami to the rest of the country. A reminder that several of the men who built Standard Oil went on to leave equally outsized marks on American life in fields that had nothing to do with petroleum at all. Railroads in the 1860s and 1870s were desperate for large, predictable, high-volume shippers because a guaranteed steady stream of freight was worth more to them than the occasionally higher rates paid by small, irregular shippers. Flagler understood this leverage perfectly and used the sheer scale of Rockefeller's refining operation to negotiate rebates, secret discounts on the publicly posted shipping rate, in exchange for guaranteeing the railroads a fixed, enormous volume of oil shipments every single day. These rebates were not available to smaller refiners, who paid the full posted rate, while Rockefeller's firm quietly paid far less for the identical service. It was, in essence, using bulk and predictability as a weapon, squeezing an advantage out of the railroad's own desire for stability, the very same value Rockefeller prized in himself. On January 10, 1870, Rockefeller and his partners formally incorporated the Standard Oil Company of Ohio with an initial capital of $1 million, an enormous sum for the time. John D. Rockefeller, 31 years old, was named president. At its founding, Standard Oil controlled perhaps 10% of American refining capacity, a strong regional position, but nowhere near dominant. That would change with astonishing speed through one of the most audacious and, in hindsight, notorious maneuvers in the history of American business. In early 1872, Rockefeller and a small group of allied railroad and refining executives quietly organized something called the South Improvement Company, a scheme designed to consolidate control over the oil refining industry by manipulating freight rates on a scale never before attempted. Under the plan, participating railroads would dramatically raise their publicly posted freight rates on oil shipments for everyone. But South Improvement Company members, including Standard Oil, would receive secret rebates, bringing their effective cost back down to something manageable. Worse still, and this was the truly ruthless part, the railroads agreed to pay South Improvement members a drawback, essentially a cash kickback, on every barrel shipped by their competitors, meaning Rockefeller's group would actually profit every time a rival refiner shipped oil without lifting a finger themselves. When word of the scheme leaked out in February 1872, it triggered an immediate, furious uproar across the oil regions of Pennsylvania. Independent producers and refiners, realizing they were about to be systematically strangled, organized protests, boycotts, and public denunciations almost overnight. The scandal became so explosive that the South Improvement Company's charter was revoked within weeks, and the scheme itself was formally abandoned by April. But the damage, or, depending on one's perspective, the advantage, had already been done. In the chaos and panic of those few weeks, terrified refiners across Cleveland, having glimpsed just how ruthlessly Rockefeller's alliance could operate and fearing total ruin, began selling their refineries directly to Standard Oil at whatever price Rockefeller offered. In a period later remembered as the Cleveland Massacre, Rockefeller absorbed 22 of Cleveland's 26 refineries in roughly 6 weeks, often paying in Standard Oil stock rather than cash, and often visiting rival owners personally to walk them, almost gently, through their own company's books before making an offer they felt they had no real choice but to accept. Some later described these visits as courteous and almost kind in tone. Others described them as being shown, with cold precision, exactly how doomed their business already was. Rockefeller himself later insisted, in interviews and in his own memoirs written decades afterward, that he had done these smaller refiners a genuine favor, sparing them from ruin in a brutally overcrowded industry and offering fair value for operations that, left independent, would very likely have failed outright within a few more years of relentless competition. There is at least a kernel of truth in that defense. Refining capacity nationally did badly outstrip demand for kerosene throughout much of the 1870s, and plenty of smaller refiners genuinely were operating at a loss. But the men who sold, almost without exception, understood perfectly well that they were selling under duress, having just watched the South Improvement Scheme demonstrate exactly how far Rockefeller's alliance with the railroads was willing to go. Whether one calls it a rescue or a hostile absorption likely depended, then as now, entirely on which side of the negotiating table a person happened to be sitting on. What is not in dispute is the speed of it. In barely a month and a half, Cleveland went from a competitive, fragmented refining market to one almost entirely controlled by a single company, a transformation so sudden that other refining centers around the country, in New York, Philadelphia, and the oil regions of Pennsylvania themselves, took careful, frightened notice. From that point forward, Standard Oil expanded, not primarily by underselling competitors on price, though it did that too when useful, but by absorbing them outright, city by city and region by region, using the same combination of superior efficiency, secret railroad advantages, and sheer financial firepower. By 1880, historians estimate Standard Oil controlled somewhere between 90 and 95% of all oil refining capacity in the United States, an almost incomprehensible degree of market dominance for any single industry. Rockefeller pursued what business historians now call vertical integration, with a thoroughness no American company had ever attempted before. Standard didn't just refine oil, it manufactured its own wooden barrels rather than buying them from outside coopers, cutting costs sharply. It built and controlled its own pipelines to move crude oil without depending on railroads at all when it chose not to. It ran its own fleet of tank cars. It employed its own chemists to develop hundreds of profitable byproducts from petroleum that had previously simply been wasted. Lubricating oils, paraffin wax, petroleum jelly compounds, various solvents, squeezing additional revenue out of every single barrel that entered a Standard Oil refinery. The company also developed and became infamous for a set of far harsher tactics. It employed agents to monitor and report on competitors' shipments, sometimes bribing railroad clerks for confidential freight information about rival refiners' business, allowing Standard to anticipate and undercut competitors' moves before they happened. In markets where a stubborn independent refiner refused to sell, Standard would sometimes engage in predatory pricing, selling kerosene locally at a steep loss, specifically in that one market, until the competitor went bankrupt, while quietly making up the difference by charging normal or even elevated prices everywhere else in the country where it faced no serious competition. Independent oil producers who tried to build their own pipelines to bypass Standard's system sometimes found their pipeline routes mysteriously blocked by land purchases, legal injunctions, or sabotage that was never conclusively traced back to Standard, though almost everyone in the industry assumed the connection. The scale of the byproduct research alone is worth pausing on because it says a great deal about how Rockefeller's mind actually worked. Where earlier refiners had treated crude oil almost purely as a source of kerosene and discarded most of the rest as waste, Standard Oil's chemists systematically found commercial uses for nearly everything left over after distillation. Heavy residues that other refiners simply dumped into rivers or burned off became lubricating oils for the era's rapidly growing population of factory machines. Lighter fractions became solvents and cleaning fluids. Paraffin wax, a byproduct once considered nearly worthless, was refined and sold for candles and later for food preservation and packaging. Standard Oil chemists are credited with identifying commercial uses for well over 100 distinct petroleum byproducts by the turn of the century, a level of thoroughness that meant Standard could often profit from a barrel of crude oil that a competitor using cruder methods would only partially convert into saleable product. It was, in its way, the same instinct that drove the 10-year-old Rockefeller to record every penny in his ledger, now applied at industrial scale, Waste in any form offended him, and eliminating it systematically became one of the quiet, less discussed sources of Standard's enormous profitability, distinct from and arguably more durable than the railroad rebates that drew so much public anger. By 1882, Standard Oil's empire had grown so large and so complicated, dozens of separate companies operating across many different states, that it ran into a serious legal problem. Under the corporate law of the era, a company chartered in one state generally could not simply own and directly control companies chartered in other states. Corporations were creatures of their home state and were not supposed to hold significant stock in out-of-state corporations. Rockefeller's own attorney, a sharp corporate lawyer named Samuel Dodd, devised an elegant and completely novel legal solution. On January 2, 1882, the Standard Oil Trust was formally created. Under this structure, the stockholders of all the various Standard Oil companies, 41 of them at the outset, transferred their shares into the hands of 9 trustees, receiving in exchange trust certificates that entitled them to a proportional share of the combined profits of the entire empire. The 9 trustees, led by Rockefeller himself, could now coordinate pricing, production, and strategy across the entire nationwide network as if it were a single company, while each individual Standard Oil subsidiary technically remained a separate corporation, chartered in its own state, satisfying the letter of the law while completely gutting its underlying purpose. Trust certificate holders received quarterly statements and dividends exactly as ordinary shareholders would, but real operating control sat entirely with the 9 men holding the underlying stock, an arrangement so tightly centralized that decisions about pricing or production in a refinery in, say, Pennsylvania or New York could be made unilaterally in Standard's headquarters in New York City without any meaningful input from the officers nominally running that subsidiary day to day. It was such an effective device that other industries noticed almost immediately and rushed to copy it. Within a decade of the Standard Oil Trust's creation, similar trust structures had sprung up to dominate the American sugar refining industry, the whiskey distilling industry, the cottonseed oil industry, and eventually tobacco, giving rise to a wave of so-called trusts across the American economy so pronounced that the entire final quarter of the 19th century is still sometimes referred to by economic historians as the Age of Trusts. The very word trust, in this narrow legal sense of a device for consolidating control over an entire industry, entered common American vocabulary almost overnight, and it stuck permanently. It is the reason the landmark 1890 law aimed at breaking up these combinations is still called the Sherman Antitrust Act today, and the reason modern regulators who review corporate mergers are still commonly described, well over a century later, as antitrust authorities, a linguistic legacy of Samuel Dodd's clever bit of legal engineering in a Cleveland law office in the winter of 1882. For roughly 2 decades, the Standard Oil Trust operated as close to an unregulated monopoly as American capitalism has ever produced, and public resentment simmered steadily beneath the surface even as Rockefeller himself became one of the wealthiest men in the country. That resentment finally found its most devastating and most personal voice in a journalist named Ida Tarbell. Tarbell had grown up in the oil regions of northwestern Pennsylvania, and her own father, Franklin Tarbell, had been an independent oil producer and refiner whose modest business was crushed during exactly the kind of consolidation campaigns Standard Oil waged throughout the 1870s and 1880s. Ida was a teenager during the South Improvement Company panic of 1872, and she later wrote that she remembered vividly the fear and fury that swept through her own household and the households of her father's fellow independent producers as word spread of the scheme, and the sense of helpless anger that lingered for years afterward as one small operator after another either sold out or went under. That childhood memory of watching her own family's livelihood threatened by forces she barely understood at the time stayed with her for the rest of her life, and it gave her adult investigative work a personal edge that purely academic economic history could never have matched. Tarbell went on to build a serious journalism career on her own merits well before turning to the Standard Oil story, having already published respected biographical work on Napoleon and Abraham Lincoln. Decades after her childhood in the oil regions, working as one of the star writers for the new, wildly popular McClure's magazine, Tarbell proposed an ambitious, deeply researched investigative series examining Standard Oil's rise in forensic detail. Her editor, Samuel McClure, backed the project generously, and Tarbell spent roughly 5 years gathering material, poring over thousands of pages of court records, congressional testimony, and internal correspondence, and conducting careful interviews with former Standard Oil employees, competitors, and even, on at least one occasion, arranged rather awkwardly through intermediaries, a private meeting with Standard Oil's own senior executive, Henry Rogers, who mistakenly believed he could charm and steer the young reporter toward a more favorable account. Beginning in November 1902, McClure's began serializing her work, which combined meticulous corporate and legal research with the kind of narrative storytelling that made it genuinely gripping to ordinary readers, not just financial specialists. Tarbell's series, later collected into a 2-volume book titled The History of the Standard Oil Company, published in 1904, systematically documented the secret railroad rebates, the drawback payments on competitors' shipments, the coordinated predatory pricing, and the sheer scale of the company's ruthlessness, all backed by court records, legal filings, and interviews, rather than mere rumor. It became a sensation, and Tarbell, along with contemporaries like Upton Sinclair and Lincoln Steffens, who were exposing corruption and abuse in other industries around the same time, came to be known as a muckraker, a term President Theodore Roosevelt coined in a 1906 speech, comparing these investigative journalists to a character in an old allegory so obsessed with raking filth from the ground that he never looked up to see the crown of glory being offered above him. Roosevelt meant it partly as a criticism of excessive negativity, but the label was quickly reclaimed with pride by the journalists themselves, and Tarbell's work in particular became a founding text of American investigative journalism, still studied today. Public opinion, already uneasy about the trust's dominance, turned decisively hostile. Political cartoonists across the country seized on Standard Oil as their favorite symbol of unchecked corporate power, most famously in a widely reprinted 1904 cartoon from Puck magazine depicting Standard Oil as a monstrous octopus, its tentacles wrapped around state legislatures, the steel industry, the copper industry, and the dome of the United States Capitol itself, reaching hungrily toward the White House. The octopus image proved so effective and so memorable that it was reused, copied, and reprinted for decades afterward, well beyond Standard Oil's own eventual breakup, becoming a kind of permanent visual shorthand in American political culture for any corporation perceived as having grown too large and too tangled up in government affairs, an image so durable that editorial cartoonists were still reaching for octopus imagery to critique corporate power generations later, in industries that had nothing to do with oil at all. Rockefeller, who rarely gave interviews and increasingly withdrew from public life during exactly this period, became for millions of ordinary Americans the single most recognizable face of everything they feared about concentrated corporate power. Effigies of him were reportedly burned at labor rallies. Preachers denounced him by name from pulpits, even as other preachers praised his generosity toward Baptist causes, and a popular children's rhyme of the era mockingly rewrote a well-known hymn as a jab at his wealth. Rockefeller himself, according to those close to him, largely declined to respond publicly to the criticism, maintaining that his conscience was clear about the business logic behind his methods, even if the broader public disagreed, and preferring to let his lawyers and company spokesmen handle the public relations battles while he focused increasingly on the philanthropic work that was already, privately, beginning to occupy much more of his time and attention than the oil business itself. The political and legal reckoning had actually begun even before Tarbell's exposé, though her work dramatically accelerated it. Congress had passed the Sherman Antitrust Act back in 1890, the first federal law explicitly prohibiting monopolistic combinations that restrained interstate trade, though its early enforcement was inconsistent and often weak. Ohio's own state courts moved first and more decisively. In 1892, the Ohio Supreme Court ruled in State of Ohio versus Standard Oil that the trust structure violated Ohio corporate law and ordered it dissolved. Rockefeller's lawyers responded with characteristic cleverness rather than genuine compliance, reorganizing the empire in 1899 as the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, a single unified holding company that simply owned controlling stock in all the former trust's subsidiaries outright, taking full advantage of New Jersey's unusually permissive corporate laws that explicitly allowed this kind of interstate holding structure. New Jersey's legislature had, somewhat cynically, rewritten its own corporate code a few years earlier, specifically to attract exactly this kind of large interstate business registration, charging companies a modest annual franchise fee in exchange for legal privileges no other state offered at the time, and it worked spectacularly well as a revenue strategy. By the early 20th century, a remarkable share of America's largest corporations, Standard Oil chief among them, were legally domiciled in New Jersey, despite operating almost nowhere near it, a pattern of corporate-friendly state law that Delaware would later perfect and inherit as the preferred incorporation state for large American businesses for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. In substance, almost nothing changed for Standard Oil itself. In legal form, the trust had simply been replaced by an equally powerful holding company. The underlying men, mills, pipelines, and market share all exactly where they had been before. The federal government, energized in part by Roosevelt's own trust-busting reputation and by the wave of public anger Tarbell's reporting had stoked, finally filed a major antitrust lawsuit against Standard Oil of New Jersey in 1906, seeking its complete dissolution under the Sherman Act. The case was assigned to the Federal Circuit Court in St. Louis, and the sheer scale of the proceedings became almost a spectacle in its own right. The government's legal team, led by the formidable trust-busting attorney Frank Kellogg, called hundreds of witnesses and entered so much documentary evidence into the record that the final printed transcript ran to well over 12,000 pages across more than 20 volumes, believed at the time to be the largest single case file the federal court system had ever produced. Rockefeller himself was deposed as part of the proceedings, and observers noted with some amusement that the man once feared as the most ruthless negotiator in American business answered question after question with a bland, almost sleepy vagueness, repeatedly claiming he could not recall specific details of decisions made decades earlier, a performance his lawyers had clearly coached him through carefully. The case ground slowly through the federal courts for years and was decided against Standard Oil by the Circuit Court in 1909, which found extensive evidence of exactly the rebate schemes, predatory pricing, and coordinated market division that Tarbell had documented years earlier. Standard Oil appealed all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and on May 15, 1911, the court issued its landmark ruling, finding that Standard Oil had indeed engaged in unreasonable restraint of trade through years of predatory practices, and ordering the company broken apart into 34 independent, separately operated companies within 6 months. The ruling was also historically significant for introducing what became known as the rule of reason into American antitrust law, the principle that not every large combination of businesses was automatically illegal under the Sherman Act. Only those that unreasonably restrained trade through demonstrably predatory conduct, a legal standard that continues to shape how courts evaluate corporate mergers and market power to this day. It is one of the great ironies in American business history that this court-ordered breakup, intended as a punishment, ended up making John D. Rockefeller personally far richer than he had ever been while the company remained whole. Because Rockefeller had held stock proportionally across the entire combined empire, the breakup left him holding proportional shares in all 34 newly independent companies simultaneously. Freed from the political cloud of monopoly accusations and now able to be valued individually by investors on the open market, the combined stock value of those 34 separate companies rose sharply within just a few years, and Rockefeller's personal fortune climbed along with it. Several of these newly independent companies would themselves go on to become titans of the 20th century oil industry in their own right. Standard Oil of New Jersey eventually became Exxon. Standard Oil of New York became Mobil, later reuniting with Exxon in 1999 as ExxonMobil. Standard Oil of California became Chevron. Standard Oil of Indiana became Amoco. Standard Oil of Ohio, eventually absorbed into British Petroleum, gave the world the Sohio brand still remembered by older residents of Cleveland. And Continental Oil grew into Conoco. In a very real sense, when Americans fill their gas tanks at an Exxon, Mobil, or Chevron station today, they are still, in some diluted corporate form, buying from fragments of John D. Rockefeller's original company. It is worth pausing here on a detail that often gets lost in the story of secret rebates and crushed competitors, because it complicates the picture in a way that matters. Throughout the very decades when Standard Oil was consolidating its monopoly most aggressively, the retail price of kerosene to ordinary American households actually fell, and fell substantially, from roughly 26 cents a gallon in the late 1860s to around 8 cents a gallon by the 1890s, even as Standard's market share and profits climbed to their peak. Rockefeller's defenders, then and now, point to this fact as evidence that his relentless drive for efficiency, scale, and elimination of waste genuinely benefited ordinary consumers who could light their homes far more cheaply than they otherwise could have. His critics respond with equal justification that a monopolist can certainly choose to lower prices for a time, both as a competitive weapon against rivals and because efficiency gains genuinely lowered costs, without that fact making the underlying concentration of market power any less dangerous in the long run, or any less damaging to the independent producers and refiners systematically squeezed out along the way. Both things, in other words, were true at once, and untangling them cleanly remains part of what makes Rockefeller such a genuinely difficult figure for historians to sum up in a single sentence. At its absolute peak in the years just before the 1911 breakup, the scale of Standard Oil's operations was almost difficult to comprehend. The company employed roughly 100,000 people across its various subsidiaries. It owned or controlled the overwhelming majority of the country's oil pipeline network, thousands of miles of it, along with fleets of tank cars and, eventually, ocean-going tankers that carried refined kerosene to markets as far away as Europe and Asia, making Standard Oil products a familiar sight in ports around the globe decades before most Americans had ever seen an automobile. The company's annual profits in its peak years ran into the tens of millions of dollars at a time, when the average American factory worker earned perhaps $400 to $600 a year. A gap in scale that is genuinely difficult to translate into modern terms without understating just how extraordinary it seemed to contemporaries. By roughly 1913, Rockefeller's personal fortune had grown large enough that he is generally regarded by economic historians as the first person in American history whose wealth crossed the billion-dollar threshold at a time when the entire annual budget of the United States federal government was itself only around $1 billion. Economists who attempt to adjust his peak fortune for inflation and compare it against the overall size of the American economy at the time, a more meaningful measure than a raw inflation adjustment, frequently rank him as the wealthiest private individual in American history, with estimates of his peak net worth, in modern equivalent terms, sometimes exceeding $300 or $400 billion. Though such comparisons across more than a century of economic change are always somewhat approximate and debated among historians. Away from the boardroom and the courtroom, Rockefeller's personal life remained, by design, almost aggressively unglamorous for a man of his wealth. In 1864, he married Laura Celestia Spellman, known to family and friends as Setty, a former school teacher from a staunchly abolitionist Cleveland family, every bit as devout and disciplined as his own upbringing had been. Their marriage was, by most accounts, a genuine partnership. Setty was intellectually sharp and morally serious, and friends often described her as the one person whose judgment Rockefeller consistently deferred to on questions outside pure business strategy. The couple had 5 children together: Elizabeth, known as Bessie, born in 1866, a second daughter named Alice, who died in infancy, a private grief Rockefeller almost never spoke of publicly; Alta, born in 1871, Edith, born in 1872, and finally their only son, John Davison Rockefeller, Jr., born in 1874, who would grow up to inherit both his father's fortune and, eventually, the difficult task of managing its public image and philanthropic legacy. Despite the family's immense wealth, Rockefeller and Setty raised their children with a deliberate, almost stern frugality that mirrored his own upbringing. The children received modest allowances tied to completing household chores, were expected to keep their own small account books recording income and expenses exactly as their father had as a boy, and were taught to mend and reuse clothing rather than simply replace it. Visitors to the family's Manhattan and Pocantico Hills homes sometimes expressed genuine surprise at how unglamorous daily life inside one of the wealthiest households in the world actually was. A deliberate choice on Rockefeller's part, born of his conviction that inherited wealth, handled carelessly, tended to ruin the character of the children who received it. His daughter Edith married into the wealthy McCormick family of Chicago, tied to the International Harvester farm equipment fortune, while Bessie and Alta both remained largely out of the public eye compared to their brother, who alone among the siblings was groomed from a young age to eventually take on responsibility for the family's business and philanthropic affairs. Rockefeller remained a devout, practicing Northern Baptist his entire life, attending Sunday services faithfully, teaching Sunday school classes for decades, even at the height of his business power, and tithing a portion of his income to his church from his very first paycheck at Hewitt & Tuttle, a habit recorded carefully in that same childhood ledger book he never stopped keeping in one form or another. He neither drank alcohol nor smoked, disapproved of card playing and dancing in his younger years, and lived in a manner that many contemporaries found almost startlingly modest given the scale of his fortune. He was, for instance, famously frugal about small personal expenses, even while making philanthropic gifts worth tens of millions of dollars, a contradiction that fascinated journalists and biographers throughout his life and afterward. Even at the absolute height of his wealth and power in the 1880s and 1890s, colleagues described a man whose daily habits barely changed from his bookkeeping days on the Cleveland docks. He rose early, ate simply, and kept his office hours disciplined and unhurried, famously refusing to be rushed into major decisions regardless of how much pressure a deal seemed to demand. A trait that infuriated more impulsive rivals and partners, but that he credited throughout his life with saving him from the kind of reckless gambles that had defined his own father's chaotic finances. He suffered from a stress-related condition later in life that caused him to lose all of his hair, including his eyebrows, and for his final decades he wore a simple wig and sometimes drew his eyebrows on with a pencil, a detail that reportedly amused him more than it troubled him. Despite the popular image of the joyless robber baron, those closest to him often described a dry, understated sense of humor and a genuine fondness for hymn singing, which he did loudly and without much regard for his own singing voice, both in church and informally at home with his family. That philanthropic instinct, present in some form since childhood, deepened enormously starting in the early 1890s, guided by a Baptist minister turned advisor named Frederick Taylor Gates, whom Rockefeller hired in 1891 specifically to help him manage the flood of charitable requests that arrived by that point at a rate of hundreds per week. Gates convinced Rockefeller to move away from scattered, small-scale personal charity toward what the two men began calling scientific giving. Large, carefully researched, strategically targeted investments in institutions capable of producing lasting structural change rather than temporary relief. It was Gates, more than anyone besides Rockefeller himself, who shaped the modern American philanthropic foundation as an institution. The results of this new approach were staggering in scale. Rockefeller had already made a founding gift toward a new University of Chicago in 1889 and would go on to donate more than $80 million to that single institution over the following decades, helping build it into one of the leading research universities in the world within a single generation. In 1901, he funded the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in New York City, the first dedicated biomedical research institution of its kind in the United States, which today survives as Rockefeller University and has produced numerous Nobel laureates. In 1902, he established the General Education Board, which poured enormous resources into building schools and improving agricultural education across the rural American South, a region still recovering from the economic devastation of the Civil War decades earlier. The board eventually helped fund the construction of thousands of rural schools, including a great many serving black communities in the segregated South at a time when public funding for such schools was often deliberately starved by local governments. In 1909, he funded the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission for the eradication of hookworm disease, targeting a debilitating parasitic infection that was silently sapping the health and productivity of millions of poor Southerners, many of whom suffered from chronic fatigue, stunted growth in children, and a general listlessness that outsiders had sometimes mistaken, unfairly and inaccurately, for simple laziness rather than recognizing it as a treatable medical condition. The Commission's field workers fanned out across the rural South, examining hundreds of thousands of people, distributing treatment, and building simple sanitary latrines to break the parasite's life cycle, a public health campaign later credited by historians with measurably improving school attendance, literacy, and long-term economic outcomes across the region it targeted, and often cited as one of the first large-scale, scientifically coordinated public health campaigns in American history. The capstone of this philanthropic transformation came in 1913 with the chartering of the Rockefeller Foundation itself, established with the explicit and rather sweeping mission to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. Over the following decades, the foundation would fund groundbreaking global public health campaigns against yellow fever and malaria, support the agricultural research that eventually contributed to the 20th century's green revolution in crop yields, and become one of the most influential philanthropic institutions on the planet, a model later studied and imitated by other American industrial fortunes, from Andrew Carnegie's own libraries and foundations to the much later Gates Foundation of the 21st century, which explicitly drew inspiration from Rockefeller's earlier example of large-scale institution-building philanthropy. By his own final tally, kept with the same obsessive precision as his boyhood ledger book, Rockefeller gave away somewhere in the neighborhood of $530 million over the course of his lifetime, an almost unfathomable sum for the era, representing a very large share of his total accumulated fortune. He formally stepped back from active management of Standard Oil around 1897, though he technically remained the company's largest shareholder and its nominal president for years afterward, with day-to-day operations increasingly handled by his longtime lieutenant, John Dustin Archbold. Following the 1911 Supreme Court breakup, Rockefeller withdrew almost entirely from business life, spending his later decades at his country estate, Kycoet, in Pocantico Hills, New York, and wintering at a Florida property called The Casements in Ormond Beach. His later years produced one of the most enduring and oddly charming images of his entire public life. The elderly Rockefeller, by then a frail but instantly recognizable figure, developed a habit of handing out shiny new dimes to children, waiters, caddies, and ordinary strangers he encountered, a small ritual widely seen at the time and still remembered today as a deliberate and rather effective piece of image rehabilitation, softening decades of public resentment built up during the height of the trust's power. He golfed nearly every day well into extreme old age, following a strict daily routine designed by his physicians, and became something of a folk curiosity purely for the sheer fact of his longevity at a time when very few Americans lived past 70. John Davison Rockefeller died on May 23, 1937, at the Casements in Ormond Beach, Florida, just 6 weeks short of his 98th birthday, having outlived nearly every rival, critic, and business partner from his early Cleveland days by decades. He was buried in Lakeview Cemetery back in Cleveland, not far from the docks where a 16-year-old boy had once walked into a shipping office and asked, quietly and precisely, for a job. The Rockefeller name did not fade from American life after his death. If anything, it grew more deeply woven into the country's institutions. His son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., spent much of his own long life managing and further expanding the family's philanthropic legacy, funding the restoration of colonial Williamsburg into the meticulously reconstructed historic site tourists still visit today, personally financing the construction of Rockefeller Center in Midtown Manhattan, largely out of his own pocket during the depths of the Great Depression, when few other investors were willing to fund such an ambitious project, and making substantial land donations that helped establish or expand several of America's most beloved national parks, including Grand Teton, Acadia, and the Great Smoky Mountains. His wife, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, became one of the founding figures behind the Museum of Modern Art in New York, channeling the family's fortune into supporting a then controversial embrace of modern and contemporary art that establishment museums of the era largely dismissed. His grandsons carried the family name into public life, directly and prominently. Nelson Rockefeller served 4 terms as governor of New York, ran unsuccessfully for the Republican presidential nomination on several occasions, and eventually became vice president of the United States under Gerald Ford following the resignations of both Richard Nixon and Nixon's original vice president, Spiro Agnew. Winthrop Rockefeller served as governor of Arkansas, notably working to advance civil rights reforms in a southern state still grappling with the legacy of segregation. David Rockefeller, perhaps the grandson most directly connected to the family's original business roots, became one of the most influential American bankers of the 20th century as longtime chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, and remained active in global finance and philanthropy well into his own late 90s, echoing his grandfather's own remarkable longevity. Institutions bearing the family name or built with family money, Rockefeller University, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Rockefeller Center, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the University of Chicago among them, remain woven into American cultural, scientific, and intellectual life to this day, a legacy every bit as visible, in its own way, as the gas station logos descended from the company that made it all possible. It is a strange and genuinely unusual thing when you sit with it for a moment, a single family's name attached simultaneously to some of the most celebrated philanthropic and cultural institutions in the country, and to a business history still taught in law schools, primarily as a cautionary example of monopolistic excess. That, in the end, is the peculiar duality that has followed John D. Rockefeller through more than a century of historical reassessment. He was, by the documented record, a ruthless and often genuinely predatory business operator who built his empire through secret railroad deals, coordinated predatory pricing, and the deliberate, methodical elimination of competition on a scale no American industry had witnessed before him. Practices serious enough that they eventually required the full weight of the United States Supreme Court to unwind. And he was, simultaneously and quite sincerely, a devout, disciplined man who gave away roughly $500 million to build universities, cure diseases, and fund the birth of modern American medical research, guided by a genuine, lifelong religious conviction that wealth carried with it a serious moral obligation. Historians still argue, more than a century later, about how to weigh those two halves of the same man against each other. And there is probably no single tidy answer. Some point to the ruthlessness as the whole story, arguing that the philanthropy, however genuinely felt, was ultimately funded by wealth extracted through methods that damaged thousands of smaller competitors and their families, and that no later generosity can fully balance that particular ledger. Others argue the opposite, pointing out that Standard Oil's efficiency genuinely did lower prices for ordinary households, that the philanthropic institutions Rockefeller funded went on to save countless lives through medical research and public health work that outlasted him by generations, and that judging a 19th century industrialist purely by 21st century standards of fair competition risks flattening a far more complicated story. Most serious historians today land somewhere in between, treating Rockefeller not as a simple villain or a simple hero, but as a case study in just how thoroughly a single relentless, disciplined mind could reshape an entire economy for better and for worse, often within the very same decade. What is certain is that the quiet boy with the little red ledger book, who once measured out his life in careful columns of pennies given and pennies earned, ended up reshaping American capitalism, American philanthropy, and the modern global oil industry so thoroughly that the world is still, in more ways than most people realize, living inside the empire he built from a muddy refinery on the banks of the Cuyahoga River. The gas station on the corner, the university research lab searching for a cure, the very language regulators still use when reviewing a corporate merger, all of it, in some quiet, diluted way, traces back to a 16-year-old bookkeeper who walked into a Cleveland shipping office one September morning in 1855 and simply refused, for the rest of his very long life, to stop keeping count.